Great. So let me first of all just welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this live seminar. This is our third theme in our symposium, symposium on online teaching and assessment. Rather odd symposium because it goes on for 4 months and we're in week 3 of it now. My name's Alvin Birdi. I'm the director of the Economics Network, and I have with me 2 other chairs who are going to facilitate this session, and then very shortly we will introduce our panelists. But let me first ask Steffi to come in, actually. Steffi?
Oh, hello. Hi. Hi, Alvin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third session of the Economics Network Symposium on teaching online, but more in general about teaching economics. So this session is about using Excel in our teaching practice. And of course, we have, Christian is going to introduce our panelists, but we have an exciting session today about using Excel in a variety of modules, macroeconomics, microeconomics, econometrics, and many more. So welcome to all the people that are now watching us live from YouTube. Remember that you can ask your questions, and we are gonna use your questions and then ask them to the panel. So I think that's it. Christian, you want to introduce the panel?
That's great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Spielmann. As Steffi said, so today is all about teaching online with Excel. There's lots of discussion now that in an online environment, our role will be more than ever to create an environment for students to engage them in independent learning. And we are asking our panel how we can do that with Excel. So we're joined by a terrific panel of 3. So we have Professor Wendy Carlin today, teaches currently at University College London in the UK, is one of the masterminds behind the core project, which has been shaking up the undergraduate introductory economics syllabus, is author of the book Macroeconomics, Institutions, Instability, and the Financial System. And as part of this book, there is a resource for a simulator which introduces students to the 3 equation model. And we will discuss with her how we can use that in our teaching. Then we also have Professor Humberto Barreto, who is based at DePauw University, a top liberal arts college in the US state of Indiana. And as author of the book Intermediate Microeconomics with Microsoft Excel, which he has just updated in a 2nd edition, he is the person to go to when we want to talk about teaching economics with Excel. So he will tell us more about why he thinks Excel is one of the solutions to blended and online learning for many of us in the time to come. And then we have my great colleague, Dr. Annika Johnson, is a lecturer at the economics department at the University of Bristol. So Annika has created online learning materials for various audiences. And she helps in the department as digital champion to make sure that her colleagues master the transition to blended and online learning. So we will talk more with her about how to use an Excel simulator to teach price setting behavior as it's presented in the core project's book, The Economy. So we are really excited to have our panel with us. Hello, everyone. And what will happen now is we give each panel member 5 minutes to just talk a little bit about their ideas of teaching with Excel and their particular resource, which most of you have hopefully had a chance to look at. So the resources were on our webpage for the last week or so for you to have a look at, and the resources will stay there for the days and weeks to come for you to revisit. So let's get started. We would like to start with Annika talking about price setting and the Microsoft Excel simulator, which we have been using there. Hi, Annika.
Hi, Christian. Am I okay to go ahead and share my screen?
Let's go for it.
Okay, hopefully we can all see that.
Yes, it's just coming.
Great. So yeah, this is an Excel-based simulator for exploring profit maximizing through the use of isoprofits. So this simulator very much came out of my early experiences teaching our first year economics principles units, which uses the economy from the core project. And in there, isoprofits are used as the sort of principal tool in profit maximizing. So if you're unfamiliar with the core approach, then it's worth saying that, you know, that the marginal revenue equals marginal cost stuff is in there too. But this approach makes a lot more sense in the core project because it fits very neatly with the ideas of constrained optimization and trade-offs that run throughout the entire text. It makes it quite a natural follow-up, for example, to things like indifference curves and budget constraints. The thing I found, however, when I first started trying to teach with isoprofits is that they do have a couple of technical barriers to overcome. The first is the not insignificant issue that they're actually quite difficult to draw, and diagrams rapidly become quite messy. It's okay when students just have to draw one curve like this, but if you have to draw multiple isoprofits, then it can become quite tricky. If I only drew one, however, I found that students were starting to forget that actually they're part of a bigger map, and that it's not just this one line that shifts around. The second thing I was struggling with is that unlike indifference curves, which we would normally draw as these downward sloping convex functions, isoprofits can actually take on a whole bunch of different shapes depending on what the cost structure of the firm is. So, you know, if you start adding in fixed costs, then the sort of zero isoprofit curve changes shape here. If you add in increasing marginal costs, you start to see upward sloping parts of the lines, which you wouldn't normally see in the indifference curves that we're looking at. And sometimes you might want to think about really wacky things like, well, what happens if we have a cubic cost function, for example? And those things are quite hard to just think about in the abstract. And it's a lot more satisfying for students and staff, I think. We shouldn't forget them too, to actually see what's happening quite quickly. So by making it easy to see them very easily, by making it easy to make changes very quickly, then it makes discussion-based sessions, which are really nice to have in economics, where you want to ask a lot of sort of what-if questions. It makes those kind of sessions really easy. So if you just want to ask, for example, what happens if your fixed costs, I don't know, drop to 10% of their previous level, then you can just change your fixed cost here from 50 to 5, and you can see all the curves shift downwards. That's actually a lot harder to draw. It would certainly take more time to draw and sort of stalls the lecture or the class that you happen to be running. We found it quite useful for answering questions like, well, what's different if we're looking at a natural monopoly? I've been looking at other questions more recently along the COVID lines of things like what happens if you think about price gouging and profiteering, and you want to look at big shocks to demand in the model, for example, and you can see what happens. Then you can just play around with the parameters and work out where the new points are that profit maximize. So you can do abstract things, but you can use it to really talk about how it relates to real world situations and how those real world situations might usefully be modeled with the tools that these students are introduced to. So I guess the most important question I should really answer is, how does this benefit students? Well, I think for me, one, they don't get hung up on or frustrated by the drawing of complicated diagrams, and they can talk about the economics instead and do the maths later. That enables them to have the discussions and explore questions, and it's a very safe space for them to experiment in their own time. It's also a lot easier to use as a marker of exams when you can look at images like this, rather than maybe ones like this we're more used to seeing in exam booklets. But yeah, that's it from me. I should pass over.
It's great, brilliant. Thank you so much, Annika. That was exciting. So I'm sure many of our participants had a look at the simulator, and we will talk a little bit more about how we can use this also in an online environment and the teaching to come. Great. Humberto, may I ask you to go next, please?
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I really loved Annika's presentation. She said so many things there that made a lot of sense to me in terms of seeing and how visual it is and things updating right away. I love all that stuff. I guess my view is just, it's really simple. I think under the tremendous upheaval that we've all experienced, it's still true that, good teaching really depends fundamentally on content, mastery of the subject. But I do think Excel is a super delivery tool because it is so visual. And instead of just talking about that abstractly, I guess I'll try to practice what I preach. I want to share my screen and just walk you through an example. So I'm going to do an example of a kind of a higher level, maybe, if you will, Excel use, which is an add-in. And I'm going to do this very, very fast. Obviously much, much faster than I would in a classroom, but I've used this many times to introduce a regression and simulation course that I've taught many times. So the basic question is, someone claims to be a 90% free throw shooter, but they only make 75 out of 100, and their excuse is it was just bad luck. And so how do you deal with that? I mean, would you accept that or not? And if you're a statistician or if you're Gauss, then it's a stupid question because you already know the answer. But if you're a normal human being sitting in a classroom, it's kind of a challenging question. It seems like a reasonable defense. I was just bad luck. Well, one way you can deal with this is very visually, very concretely, is you can set up a virtual free throw shooter in Excel. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can actually see the cells and what I'm typing in. But the heart of the simulation is going to be Excel's random number generator. And I just typed in rand, and now if I hit the F9 key, I'm hitting the F9 key every time you see those numbers bouncing around on your screen. That's because I'm hitting the F9 key. And then I can make a free throw shooter by using an if statement. So if I say, if this person claimed to be a 90% free throw shooter, so if the random draws from a uniform distribution, of course I would explain all this carefully and it would take a lot more time, but I'm just going fast for the sake of brevity. So if the person's a 90% free throw shooter, any random draw less than 0.9, they made it, it's a 1. And if it's greater than 0.9, then they missed. So there they made that one. And now I'm going to hit F9. And as I hit F9, you don't see much change there. But you would think eventually I would get a 0.9 there. I got it, and I went too fast. There we go. So there's a miss. Now, how can I make a free throw shooter take 100 free throws? Well, it turns out I can embed rand directly in the if statement. So I can just say this and get the same outcome, right? So again, I'm simulating and I am concretely setting up this free throw shooting example. So now if I hit F9, I'm taking several free throws here. I'm taking 7 free throws, but I really want to take 100. I'm hitting F9 and sometimes you see zeros pop up, right? Those are misses. So if I can just sit here and drag this down to 100, then I think I'm all set. And as I do this, you can think about how you would be in a classroom and what I'm doing. And I would go much, much slower. But I think the idea of the concreteness and the visual nature of all of this is the dominant concept I'm trying to get across here. So how many did you make out of 100? Well, we just need to sum up all the items in column B. So out of that set of 100, I made 89. And now if I hit F9, this time I made 90, made 92. Now, just by hitting F9, you can almost come to a conclusion about the question because I'm not really seeing anything, under 80. There's some bounce there, but not a lot. But how do you actually do a real simulation? Well, here comes the add-in. So I come over here to the add-ins tab, and this is part of an econometrics book that I co-wrote with my former colleague at Wabash College, Frank Howland. And so I can just say, do 1,000 F9s. So do 1,000 repetitions of 100 free throws. So I'm going to click this button, And Excel gives me a quick message there, and here's my result. Now think of all the things you can do. You can think about the normal central limit theorem. Instead of doing 100, you could do 50 free throws. You could do all kinds of things. You can do things, you can explain, well, Monte Carlo is just an approximation. If you do more repetitions, so now I hit proceed and it goes a little bit slower, but you can still see it's very fast. And now I've got a better kind of approximation to this, but look at this answer to the question, very concrete answer, and then I'll turn it over to Wendy. Very concrete. Here's the point. I took 10,000 sets of 100 free throws, and if I was a 90% free throw shooter, I haven't gotten 75 yet. The lowest one I got was 77. So I think I'll just try to say a couple of things by way of summarizing my presentation here. I don't know that much about online teaching. I'm really interested to see what people say, but I do know a lot about teaching with Excel because I've been doing it for a long time. And its most powerful, clearly most powerful feature is how visual it is. You can take very complicated ideas and make them accessible. That's what really excites me about using Excel and teaching with Excel. And I've had pretty good success with it over the years. I'm really happy, as Christian said earlier, really happy that I put together this second edition that's open access. It's completely freely available. You can take examples out of it. It's mostly intermediate micro, but you can use, there's an application on taxes you can use in public finance. There's several game theory chapters that are pretty good. There are all kinds of things that you can use and just cut them out of the book and just use them in your courses. It's all about the content. And I hope it helps someone. And I just want to give the Economics Network a great thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this morning. And I'm really curious to see what kind of questions people come up with. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Humberto. Brilliant. Yeah, so Excel, really important skill as well. We just see a comment there on the screen as well for our students. We will talk more about the employability aspects of that as well. But first, Wendy, over to you for your short presentation.
Okay. Hang on. Right. This is not working.
So while Wendy is setting up, I can also say there are lots of interesting chat messages coming in the YouTube chat. So we are making notes of that, and we'll cover a lot of that later on as well in the session.
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Can you see that?
And this is perfect. Yeah. Okay. Over to you.
Amazing. Okay, great. Well, this is so thanks a lot, and it's really great to have the chance to talk about this. This is thinking about macro, and so it's a very different context from the micro examples that that Humberto and Annika have discussed. So I think it's probably worth giving a bit of background as to why you might want to use a simulator in teaching macro, because I think the logic is quite a different one. Modern macro is typically taught with a purposeful policymaker who has objectives and constraints and facing an economy subject to all kinds of temporary and permanent supply and demand shocks. Are you getting a repeat on this? Or is that okay?
Sounds fine.
Okay, good. Okay, so what kind of courses? You can use this particular simulator in the first year using cores the economy, in the second year using an intermediate macro course using my book with David Soskis or Blanchard, for example, or some other books that use the same kind of structure for the economy. And in third year, topics in macro policy type courses where you really want to put to work the kind of modeling that students have learned in their intermediate macro with policy episodes and data. So the usual tools that we use are obviously equations, diagrams, data charts, historical and contemporary episodes of shocks and policy responses. And what students find really hard in macro is understanding the model dynamics. Secondly, how do the different models relate to each other? So they get taught, say, an inflation targeting model, and then they get taught a model about debt dynamics, and they have another model about exchange rate dynamics. But how do you put all of that together if you're analyzing a particular episode? And then episode meaning episode in the world. So the macro simulator, invaluable, it may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it helps to deal with these three problems in macro teaching. So think about just the first problem, understanding model dynamics. This is what it would look like in an on-the-page model. This is, you can draw the impulse response functions that do give a different insight than the model on the left. But if you do the same thing in the simulator, then as Humberto and Annika brought out, you see it appearing before your eyes. So you can see what happens to inflation, the nominal interest rate, the real interest rate, GDP, and growth. But what about this question of how the models relate to each other? Suppose that these are the kind of questions we want to answer. Where does the economy end up? How does the economy adjust? What is the central bank doing to assist that adjustment process? And what role is played by a forward-looking foreign exchange market? And what are the implications for public sector finance? Students have studied each of them, but even good students need to check their analytical treatment. So here we go. You can get the results with an inflation targeting central bank for inflation. Check out what happens to the real exchange rate and the nominal exchange rate. And then you can put that together with the debt dynamics, looking at the implications for the primary budget, the total budget, and for public debt. So this is for one particular shock. Okay, I'm running out of time. How do we relate the models to the world? There's a whole set of examples on the website that do that. The one I sort of set as an exercise in advance of the session was the first one, which was changing the inflation target. Does this work online? I think it's really great for individual and group online projects. The students can compare the analytical and simulation results and explain the dynamics. They can plot the numerical results and compare those to data. You can add random shocks, ask them to collect the data and analyze it. You can get them to play a game, and there are three different levels of sophistication in the game. They don't know what the shocks are, so they have to diagnose the shocks, think about the model that they've learned, and then take a decision as a policymaker and get them to write up their results. This is the game set up just to give you a look at what it looks like. And it's really good for things like hyperinflation and deflationary traps. So you can get, like in the current situation, you could plunge the economy into a deflationary trap, and then the student has to figure out how to deal with that when, for example, the interest rate hits the zero lower bound. So that's where I'll stop. Yeah, okay, last point.
Brilliant. Excellent.
Opportunities for linking to research and for assessment along all of these lines. Yeah. Okay, I'll finish it there.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy. Yeah, 3 really exciting presentations. Thanks for that. So I had with one eye, I had a look at the chat on YouTube as well. And there was a lot of discussion about with how much experience do our students actually come to university when it is about Excel. So do they know enough that we can give them the simulator and let them just play around with that? And I guess because all three of you have taught different kinds of students, maybe at different levels. It would be quite interesting to have the views of all of you. Do students have enough experience? And if not, what's the best way of teaching that? Would you go for a fresher course at the very beginning to bring them up to speed, or are you teaching them along? How do you do that? Annika, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's quite a simple answer. It's that you can't really assume what they do or don't know. And there's a huge range of skills people come in with, depending on what they've been doing throughout their secondary school or their experience prior to university. So I don't think it hurts to assume nothing. So I tried to build the simulator I showed as just about as simple as it can be. They literally have to click on the boxes and change the numbers. There are some check boxes they can turn on and off as well, but it's very much a sort of point and click approach. It's quite hard to cause irreparable damage, but if they do, it's as simple as closing down the version they've opened and downloading a new version. And I think there's something valuable in that seeing that it's okay to wreck the code, and there's a way to refresh and recover it. I think we spoke in earlier sessions, somebody mentioned about the fear of opening Excel and trying to do things with it. This is a really safe way to use Excel. Yeah.
So in a way, there's not much Excel knowledge actually needed, right? Which I guess it was a little bit different in Humberto's example, right? Because you were actually coding. How would you do that with students?
So yeah, so my simple answer is yes. I don't know if you can tell by looking at me, but I've been doing this for a long time. And I would stand in front of a group of people with a mouse and say, this is a mouse, and you move it around on your screen and things happen. And I don't need to do that anymore. Excel is ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. And so is Google spreadsheets. So they kind of know how to use a spreadsheet. I guess my answer depends on what level you're talking about, that, of mastery of the software. And what I teach my students and what they value tremendously is they go from normal users of Excel to quite sophisticated users of Excel. They can use add-ins, they can install add-ins, and there's tons of them. And they can do some simple coding. And I'll say this about coding, and I'll turn it over to Wendy because I don't want to just babble endlessly, but coding in Excel is a lot easier than in any, if you don't go to VBA, if you don't go to Visual Basic, if you just stay in Excel, I don't think it can be much simpler than typing equal rand, open paren, close paren to get a random number generator going. That's about as simple as it gets. And my students learn all kinds of functions. And at the end of the semester, I give them a list of all the functions they've learned, which is just really great. So they know the functions exist. They know how to do simple things like an average and a sum, but they don't know how to do more complicated things, but that's what they'll pick up in the class. So they do gain a great deal of mastery of more knowledge of the software. Great question.
Yeah, and I guess there's an increasing demand for these kind of the programming skills or coding skills nowadays as well.
But beyond the basic level, right, to a more sophisticated level. I agree.
Okay, Wendy, anything to add? How are your students doing with Excel?
Terrible. Some of them really don't have a clue. So obviously the simulator is not a way for them to learn about coding in Excel. So it's like Annika's in a sense. It's a pre-programmed simulator which is dealing with a lot of complexity on the model side, and that's being hidden from the students. So Excel is being used in a very different way in this macro model. But in general, teaching students in the first year simple data handling with Excel, the variety of experience with it every year, I think we all find fairly shocking in the literal sense of the word, in that some of the students really don't seem to have opened a spreadsheet program. And I think you're going to have a session later with Eileen Tipoe talking about the doing economics, where we build those kind of skills from the very beginning. So I think, you know, Excel is obviously just used in a huge variety of different ways, and we can take. So what Humberto's was showing is we can think of how we can use those kind of applications in lots of different settings.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I ask something? So two things. First, that we are actually in the second part of this session talking about how to teach students to use Excel as well. Our panelists are focusing on that. So we have Eileen, Tim, and Lory talking about it. And I have a question for the panelists. So, especially, Wendy mentioned something about making the students work in groups with this simulator. So my question is, can you give us more tips on how exactly you will set a group work for our students? Because this is gonna, especially in the new scenario that we have to teach online, this is gonna be very important to help students to work in groups in order to create a sort of identity and sense of belonging to the classroom. So if you can give us any tips about how you go around doing that, that would be great.
Yeah, I think there's just really a plethora of ways of doing it. I think some of the problem, you know, the issues that people have with setting group work, and even the whole question of open book type assessments is, you know, how do you get enough variation in the problems to create, you know, genuine challenges for lots of students? And I think the simulator is very good for that, because you can get students, you can set a problem where you introduce random shocks, for example. So the solution that's being observed by the students, the impulse responses that come out are going to be different. So different for different groups, and that means that you're going to have a different set of data that they've generated and they've observed. And so they'll be writing up, even in a very simple way, they'll be writing up different, you know, slightly different stories. With using the game part of it, again, that's very easy to generate differences across groups. And I think that's really, you know, part of the trick of successful group work. You want to get them working in the same part of the course, but you don't want them all to be doing exactly the same task, because that's somehow boring, and it's also very boring to mark. So getting them to do different things. So you could also get them to, you know, flip a coin, and you know, different, or use the random number generator to pick the size of the shock, to pick whether it's a positive shock or a negative shock, to select, for example, which version of the open economy, of say the fixed exchange rate case, the group is actually working on. So I think thinking of variation is a good way of thinking of how you, in, you know, pretty low cost, create interesting group work.
That's great. Could I just follow up on that question? You said that you do the group work, and then that's maybe an assessment or some assignment. Do you think of any kind of sharing of what the students have been working on, and can we do that in an online environment? So could we use small group sessions for that, or does anyone in the panel maybe have ideas? Like, could there be other forms of group work which don't necessarily just have the assignment as an output, but feed into some sort of sharing and discussing about the economy?
I guess if I could jump in, I guess the natural, obvious thing to do is the breakout room. And I just wanted to throw out there the idea of varying your delivery. So that's like kind of an American baseball pitching thing, but I think it works in cricket too. So you can't just do the same pitch over and over and over again. I think if one good thing is going to come out of all this, maybe it blows up the chalk and talk I stand up there, stage on the stage, and I just talk for an hour. It's got to stop. So maybe you talk for a little bit, and then you put them in groups in their Zoom breakout room. And I think Wendy mentioned, I think this is very powerful in several of my workbooks in the intermediate micro book. You just click a button and you get randomly different parameters in the problem. So say you have a Cobb-Douglas utility function, you can just change the exponents and you can change the prices and income, and it's a magically different problem for each of the groups. And then you can put them back together to share their outcomes. But I guess one thing that has worked for me for many years is I try to do different things across the days, and even now with online teaching, I'm going to do different things within the day because nobody can watch video for an hour. I don't care how scintillating you are, it's impossible. So I don't know, I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, great.
So some very good points there, Humberto. I was just wondering whether any of the panelists had used there's a share, I believe there's a share function in Excel which allows people to sort of jointly work on a spreadsheet. I don't know how that would work in a simulation context, because you don't really want people to mess about with the with the kind of programming, but I was wondering whether any of you had tried that.
I haven't tried it, but I want to throw out another one, which is Microsoft Teams, which is a rival video software. They claim that you can easily work on the same document. And I'm guessing Zoom and all the others and Google Meet are going to enable that pretty soon.
Okay, so if I can just jump in here. So in our kind of lab-based teaching, where we would have lots of computers and students would sit on Excel and work their way away, we would have the chance to actually just go to students who are running into problems, just look over their shoulders, suggest what they could do next. How do we do that in an online environment if the students are not in the lab? Any thoughts? I mean, I know there is still some month till October, but I guess we need answers for that.
I think that's why groups are good, because my sense is that there's a lot of variation in knowledge among the students, and one thing we've got to do in the online environment is to leverage that willingness to share and to teach among the students. So helping each other, creating groups in which they're working on a common problem, and using the chat. I mean, what I worry about is the kind of the silent students, the passive ones that are hard to get to engage, and I worry that may be even more of a problem with online groups. You know, the sort of smaller groups, the breakout groups that we're talking about. So if anyone has any experience of how to activate those unwilling to come forward. I mean, I know there's been some discussion about how all of the online environment has been very helpful for some students who don't relish social interaction. So for a particular subset of students, this way of working suits them very well. But I don't think that quite deals with the students who are passive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe sorry,
Annika?
Christian. I was just saying, in group projects we've run in the past, which weren't necessarily designed for the online environment, but I think would translate quite well, any element of a group project that has an initial individual stage, say that people have the chance to develop their contributions whilst maybe seeing other people's contributions as well. So making use of like collaborative working spaces. So there are ways to do it within places like Moodle and Blackboard, where they have sort of within the VLE wikis, where they have access to each other's, you know, teams, other members of their team's pages, and they can see, you know, oh, I'm looking at, you know, this particular aspect for, I don't know, Argentina, or I'm looking at this particular aspect, but for France, and then they can bring it together in a collaborative space, be that a Google Doc or within the VLE or whatever. And I think it's so important to give them that first chance to explore their ideas and work out what it is they're going to bring to the team, as well as being able to see what other people are doing. It's a bit of a behavioral nudge, I think, there. Yeah, that's my view anyway.
That's all very interesting, but it's not just online teaching what is going to change next year. Something that I am also worried about is that the students are going to come with a lot of questions about economics, a lot of questions about economies. So there has been a lot of things change. And sorry if I refer a lot to Wendy, but I'm a macroeconomist and I teach macroeconomics. So Wendy's book starts with 2008, a financial crisis happened. And, but that was well in the past now. I think next year students are going to come to our classrooms and they say 2020, many crises happened. So we have the problems of the pandemic, we have the problems of Black Lives Matter. And so I know this goes a little bit beyond what is just the use of Excel, but how will you try to use what you have already to motivate and to help students to understand that economics can help us to explain the world that we are living in? And this is for, of course, microeconomists or macroeconomists, for both.
Yeah, sure. I think it's great. It's great for us. This is a brilliant time to be teaching economics. What could be better? We will have very highly motivated students because they are aware that they're experiencing unprecedented economic times globally, and if they're not interested in it, then I guess they'll very quickly get the message they're doing the wrong subject, which in more calm times might not have got through to them. But I think we've got the goods. So in the sense that we can definitely help students to process the nature of the shocks that have occurred, to understand the difference between the typical economic shocks that they analyze that come from within the economy and compare that with this public health shock, and the fact that the economic shock was in response to that. So this was a deliberate shutdown of the economy. So there's plenty to discuss about the contrast of those two settings. And then to understand, thinking of the array of shocks they study, where does this one fit in? Yeah, is it a shock on the demand side? To what extent is it adequately handled by thinking of a single country? Well, no, not really. So they have to be aware of the open economy. Will be very sensitive to thinking that even for understanding macro, they have to understand the sectoral structure of economic activity and to think about which sectors were particularly affected by this government-induced economic shutdown. And then to think about the availability of the policy instruments and why different countries have chosen different mixes and what the constraints facing policymakers are in different countries. So I think you could actually teach your entire macroeconomics by starting from 2020.
What about from a microeconomics perspective? What are your plans for next year? How will you introduce these problems to your students?
Shall I go first on that? Okay. I've been thinking a lot about this. I think whenever we have a big crisis, the first thought is always for the macro, but I think there's a lot of the micro side as well in this crisis. As I said before, I've been thinking about when you're talking about the theory of the firm, thinking about profit maximizing and profiteering and regulation and all those aspects. But I also think that when it comes to teaching the basics of social interaction and the basics of game theory, there's a lot of very interesting things that have gone on to do with social preferences. It's not just people acting as those, single economic beings. They're thinking about other people's feelings. We're seeing people volunteering for the NHS and putting themselves at risk. We're seeing firms volunteer to produce things without any profit. There's a very interesting story about what the utility function almost looked like over this period. And I think that'll fit very well into a lot of first year principals narratives, as well as maybe, more specific courses higher up in behavioral and so on.
I guess my initial reaction was really flippant. I thought, well, if nothing else, it's given us another example of an externality. But a deeper answer is, we've always had to do this. This isn't a new question. So a good teacher has always tried to use what's happening in the world around them to come up with good examples. I don't know about England, but in the United States, I'm positive that every one of my students knows about toilet paper flying off the shelves and going into a big grocery store or a big box retailer and seeing wide swaths of stuff missing, no flour, what's that? I think you have to bring in what's happening outside, because you're right. I think students come and they want answers, but I don't think this isn't new. And I don't think we can forget that you need theory. You need some kind of foundation of kind of understanding how economists see the world and what they do. And so I think that part of my course will stay constant. I'm still trying to deliver that, but I'm going to have a lot of different examples from the world around me that I would have never used a year ago. The world is so different today. It's just mind-boggling.
So I was just wondering whether some of the examples that we could use with Excel would delve into other fields. So obviously there's a lot of concern about the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of concern about climate issues at the moment, and Excel's pretty good at doing dynamic simulations, as many of you have talked about. But I wondered, perhaps Annika, you've taught some of these other subjects. I wonder whether you've used Excel in other settings outside micro and macro, specifically some of the other subfields of economics.
You're going to have to give me a hint, Alvin.
Well, I'm thinking of simulations of, models of fisheries, for example, models of climate degradation, sort of longer term dynamic models where people can manipulate parameters of models and look at sort of simulations not dissimilar to what has happened, what Wendy's been doing with the macro. But don't worry if you're not familiar with.
No, I can't say I've actually used them outside of.
I could ask the question also to Humberto,
yeah.
Because I was wondering whether now you're in your third edition of the book, whether there are plans to sort of think about some of the other areas outside. It seems very much directed at the core of microeconomic analysis, but I wonder whether you've had a chance to think about some of the sort of broader applied areas. I noticed you said in your video that you detest abstraction and like kind of concrete examples, and here would be an opportunity to sort of talk about, for example, the COVID pandemic, or the crisis in our fisheries, or climate change, for example.
Yeah, those are great ideas. I think what I've been trying to do over the years is, and I like doing this, is take something complicated, because I'm not smart enough to think up the complicated thing myself, but make it accessible to students. So and I know there are some people listening that can do this. I'm positive of it. You just take a spreadsheet and make one cell depend on the other. And so you could propagate some kind of a disease or something spreading, the cells could turn red, or something could happen to show how the thing moves, depending on, rates of infection and other things that can happen. So yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities for new ways of showing students concrete visual demonstrations of examples and things. And I hope I still have enough energy and kind of creativity to work on some of those. But yeah, I'm definitely going to work on that.
And then just one other question that came to mind, just to take us back again to the sort of tips and hints for how we deal with group work online in the September period. There were some interesting comments in the chat. Parama Chowdhury mentioned the use of online versions of Excel. Christian and I have done some teaching with online versions of Excel, and they're just not as good. Quite frankly, they don't work as well. They don't have all of the functionality. But I wondered whether you might want to comment on a couple of the other suggestions. Stephen Proud was talking in the chat about using Excel together with other tools like OneDrive, for example, because you can see in real time what people are doing in OneDrive if files are if they're changing files there, and of course it can keep previous versions as well, so you can look at what other students might have done and saved and sort of move between them. That might be a way of sort of getting interaction going. And then Peter Dawson mentioned in forums like this, with Zoom and to collaborate and so on, using breakout groups and screen sharing so that people can actually discuss with other members of a group what they are thinking and how they're manipulating some of these spreadsheets. So I guess this is a sort of speculative question. I'm just wondering whether any of you have any thoughts of maybe trying to use your simulations in conjunction with other tools like this. Wendy?
So one thing that I think definitely works in macro classes is kind of setting up debates about what should be done and what the consequences are, and so I think that it would be possible to set up some questions, some problems, which could be sort of loosely related to COVID, or there's a lot of discussion, for example, that there's bound to be hyperinflation, right? And then other people are saying, well, there's bound to be a deflationary crisis if we don't have this huge amount of policy intervention. So you could kind of try to take these some of the questions that are being discussed and make them more analytical by putting students into teams where they had to come up with the best justified case for their particular line of argument. And I think those ways of using, somehow trying to get engagement and connection between the theoretical modeling and being able to talk about it and communicate how the mechanisms in the model are actually working is one of the skills that we're quite poor at. And what would be really interesting would be to think of ways that could sort of be leveraged in a online environment, especially when you've got huge classes like the kind of classes I teach. So whether you could somehow have some of this group work going on, and where an outcome or an output had to be a very short media file that somehow brought together these two sides of the debate with background, a background document showing the logic for the argument. So trying to think in that way of getting them to be actively learning, but also to be communicating their results is something I'd like to get some more ideas about.
Thanks. And so I apologize for the pop-ups that keep popping up on the screen to do with Zoom. It has a kind of mind of its own. But let me hand back to Christian.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you. I can see our students in October creating videos and using maybe Excel simulators to discuss maybe the COVID crisis and other big topics. I think there's lots of potential, and I think this discussion with our panel today has shown us that we can use Excel in a really beneficial way to facilitate student learning. And what I got from it was, like, in a time where face-to-face on-campus interaction is not possible, we have to kind of facilitate the students' learning environment to make self-learning as interesting and as engaging as possible. And maybe tools like Excel are a good way of doing that. So I think we are coming to the end of the first part of our session. As Steffi already suggested at the beginning, we are now then moving on to the second part of our panel discussion, which will be around using Excel for data literacy and data skills. And so for me now, it's time to, first of all, really thank our panel. It was terrific ideas. Thank the participants for the comments so far. There were lots of other interesting discussions going on in the chat window as well. So before we go into a short break, we have prepared a Mentimeter poll for our participants, and you should hopefully see the Mentimeter, there it is, the Mentimeter QR code and the webpage. If during our short break you would like to answer these questions and to get you engaged, that would be great. But for now, let me thank you, our panel again. That was great. And we speak again at 3:05. So just over 5 minutes, 7 minutes. Thank you very much, everyone.
Sorry, audio problems. I think we're back on now. Apologies for that slight hitch with the technicalities. We do have our panelists, our new panelists, and so welcome to the second half of this this session on Excel and teaching online with Excel. The panelists were chatting away happily in the break there, so I just had to mute them. So I'm just reminding them that you're going to need to unmute yourselves when we come to the actual session. So let me hand over to, I think, Steffi, I think.
Yes, that's correct. Hi, hello everybody, welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. And I just want to say welcome to our new panel. We have today Tim Burnett from the University of Warwick, although he's moving in 8 days to Aston University. Lory Barile from Warwick and Eileen Tipoe from the University of Oxford. And they all have shared resources on how they are using Excel. And actually, in this session, we're going to be talking more about how they are helping students to become familiar with Excel and use Excel to solve word problems in a way. So I'm not going to take too much time to introduce them. What I'm going to do is kind of allow themselves to briefly introduce themselves, introduce their material. And I'm going to add one question. Why Excel and why not, I don't know, Stata or something a bit more complex? So shall we start with Lory, then we move to Tim, and then we move to Eileen, if that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay, so I'm on mute now. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Steffi, for the introduction. And yeah, I'm Lory Barile, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Warwick. Now, I start by talking about why I've used Excel in my teaching. And this goes back to 2014 when I was teaching at the University of Chester. So at that time, I had the chance to, let's say, design my own statistics module within a new combined honor economics degree. And I remember that I attended one of these GTA's workshop organized by the Economics Network, where on the second day we had a speaker talking about, from the government economic service, talking about, how our students most of the time are quite good at solving very complex economics problems and, dealing with the technicalities of this, but they don't really know when they are graduated and they start to work in the workplace, they don't really know how to use very basic softwares. And I remember he explicitly mentioned Excel as an example. So having had some previous experience at the University of Bath for using Excel teaching for economics teaching, I decided to combine Excel and for the teaching of statistics. So to use Excel for teaching statistics for a level 4 module, basically. So what I've done, so the main reason why I started to use it is because of the problem solving and employability skills that Excel can offer to the students. And I tried to do this, I tried to make sure that they learned how to use the software and the basic, functions that are included in Excel in many different ways. So, for example, I designed, different exercises every week that the students could solve. And I offered them some, the solutions, some detailed solutions for that. I also created some demonstration files. I want to share an example of how I've used the demonstration file with the students, if that's okay. Sorry. So, Okay, so basically during the lecture, after introducing the topic, I've asked them to work on an exercise that was linked with the topic that I introduced. So this is an example linked to a descriptive statistics lecture, and I discussed, how
Lory,
we can use
I don't think we can see your screen. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought. Okay. I think I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah, now I can see it.
You can see it now. So if I put it in the full screen mode, you can't see it anymore. Can you see it now?
No.
No, okay. So I will just leave it small then. I don't know. When I change the view in full screen, it seems that you are unable to see it. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So the example is just a simple exercise related to the histogram. And as you can see at the end of the exercise, I've asked the students to check their solution looking at the demonstration file. So basically in the demo, which is an example is uploaded on the Economics Network website, and it's related to the histogram, I've showed the student how to do a histogram using the data analysis tool kit, and also using, providing the classes and making decisions on how, the histogram has to look like for their particular data analysis. And then I've also used Excel to make the classes a bit more interactive with the students. So for example, at some point I've done an experiment with them to make a bit more concrete the idea of the central limit theorem. And it was also an opportunity to show the students how we can use Excel to do some data collection. And then, so these were basically the main reasons why I included Excel in my teaching. So to engage the students with the statistic class, and also for the employability skills. But also to make sure that they've learned, how to use the software. What I did in the end was to test their abilities to work with the software. And so the final exam was designed as an online assessment, and then they had to submit the assessment completely online, which is probably the most interesting thing at the moment, given that we are moving our teaching online.
Actually, yeah. Lory, we have a question on that, so that's coming up in a little while. So no worries if you don't have enough time to explain that right now.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to briefly introduce the reasons why I've used Excel, and then the final thing I want, if I still have some time to talk, the final thing that I want to say, why Excel and not other softwares. I think that a good thing of using Excel for the first year students is that compared to other softwares that are, for example, free online, such as Gradle, or I think R is also free to download for the students. The good thing about Excel is that it doesn't need programming skills, so it's a point and click, method of doing data analysis or charting, our data. So I think that it's quite good for the students to familiarize, with some sort of data analysis in the first year, and it's also free. I mean, compared to other softwares, Excel, it's free to access for them in any university computer. Well, actually, we have also State and SPSS, but they can use it, at home. It's compared to other softwares. I think these are also the other two advantages that Excel has, and that's it really.
Thank you very much, Lory. Tim,
thanks.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think Lory's still sharing her screen.
Yeah,
I think she stopped now. Yeah.
Excellent. So thank you. And thank you, Steffi, for inviting me to talk through some ideas that I have about using Excel in economics. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to try and go full screen, and let me know if this works. So here we go. Can you see a picture of a duck?
We cannot see anything.
Okay. Let's see.
And for our audience, we promise you we tried this many times before. We can see it now.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk for 5 minutes. I've got a timer set. I'm going to talk for 5 minutes about a very, very simple idea. And unfortunately, when we have the simplest ideas, often require the most explanation. But I like to call this, I'm calling this "Do Not Feed the Ducks," and hopefully it will become apparent why. So, bad news for fans of ducks is that this is not actually related to ducks or any other type of birds. So, but really it's about whether or not we can get positive outcomes from allowing students time to play with data before we even teach them economic theory. So before we start talking about theoretical relationships, simply give the students time and space to play around with a data set, to find some relationships for themselves. And it seems like a really minor tweak to your teaching in terms of just giving the students the data in advance, but actually in terms of the way and what we're hoping to achieve with teaching, it's actually quite a significant ideological leap. So where's this idea come from? So 3 years ago, I took a step away from economics education and started work at the liberal arts department at Warwick, which is really characterized by its problem-based learning kind of methods. And this having to work within problem-based learning really sort of forced me to reflect on the way that I'd been teaching and teaching economics for quite a few years, and questioning like, have I been doing it wrong in a way? Have I been teaching the best way? And anyone who's at D in last September would I start sounding like the weirdo radical in the room when I start talking about this kind of stuff. So I'm going to basically try and think about whether or not we can take the best bits of problem-based learning and apply it to economics education, while at the same time not terrifying people and coming across like some kind of problem-based learning evangelist. But the principles of problem-based learning is simply that you provide students with something open-ended, something they can explore for themselves, and they can identify what they need to know, carry out some self-directed inquiry, and then present their ideas and have this kind of debrief session. And it's crucially with problem-based learning, you can see that the whole process is student-centered as opposed to lecturer-centered like a lot of economics education. So can we get this kind of student-centered element into economics? So why can data be an open-ended situation? It can be a puzzle. And providing it before we formally teach, so giving it in a hands-off way, here you go, it gives students creative space to explore, and it transfers the responsibility for learning and exploring that data away from you as an educator. You're no longer telling the students what is in the data set, you're giving them it as a start. And and similarly, it's hands-on for students. And theoretically, if we are sufficiently hands-off, we can actually encourage students to almost, if they need to explore it, what do they need to do in order to explore it? What kind of technical skills, simple technical skills in Excel, can we encourage students to actually develop for themselves? And this idea that in doing so, in exploring the data for themselves, students will encounter relationships. They will discover relationships for themselves. So when you lecture them, we provide students in should you ever need it, this is a theory to explain something, but when we provide the data to the students first, a data first approach, students find that they need a theory in order to explain the data. And that kind of shifting of things, that reversal of the information that's provided is it's very subtle, it's very simple, but it changes a lot of dynamics, as I said. It allows students to construct ideas about economic relationships before we can reinforce these with theory lectures, as we would normally. And students will then be acquiring knowledge in lectures to deal with the problem that they encountered, and it's much more powerful than having knowledge in reserve in case a problem is ever encountered. So this idea of learning to explain as opposed to having this knowledge in reserve. So I've got about 15 seconds. So what can this approach do? And really, by focusing education on the students and requiring students to dig away for themselves in data, it has a lot of benefits. They're really holistic. They become self-directed, they become more confident, they become less reliant on knowledge being handed to them because you're getting them to do stuff for themselves. They're more engaged with the theory that you teach, and there's literally the employability skills are extraordinary. And I know this from actually working in this environment for 3 years, the kind of skills that students come out with when you trust them to build them themselves by giving them time and space. So I've got no time left. So in conclusion, don't feed the ducks. Help them fend for themselves because they'll be better off in the long run. Or if avian metaphors are a little bit complex for some of our viewers, give students data before you explain economic theory. So yeah, so that's my general
Thank
idea.
you.
I didn't get around to why Excel, but I think we'll have plenty of time to talk about that after Eileen's had a crack.
Thank you very much, Tim. And yeah, you are right. We will have some more time. And I guess we are going to have a lot of questions about this method as well. Eileen, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Eileen. I'm an early career academic at Oxford University, and I've been using a resource that I developed called Doing Economics, mainly for small group teaching, as is usually done in Oxford, but it can be used in larger groups. So what I'm going to do now is just share my screen and show you a quick walkthrough of the site. Okay, so you should be able to see it now. So this is the Doing Economics website. So you can see the URL is here. So, and you can also find it through the core website. So if you go to core-econ.org and you scroll down to the middle of the page, there's Doing Economics, and if you click Get Started, it's free. It will lead you right to this page. So just to walk through this, oops, okay, there. So just to walk through the site, so if you just click Read Now, you can see that the site is structured as a series of empirical projects. So there are 12 of them in total. So most of them, all of them will follow this general structure. So here's one about climate change. So there's going to be some learning objectives for the whole project, an introduction to motivate the kind of data and questions that the students will be answering. And then you can see that there are 3 different tracks. So today we'll be focusing on the working in Excel track, but there's also students can do the same project, exactly the same questions in R and also in Google Sheets for a more collaborative working. So you can see that each project is split into 3 different parts. So most projects are split into 2 or 3 different parts. And I'll show you an example. So here, so this project was about downloading some data from NASA about the surface temperature over time, and then students can plot some line charts for it. And now here we're using this temperature data to look at to teach students about standard deviation. So you can see that each part has some learning objectives. So here, it's kind of trying to teach students the statistics alongside like working with data, rather than like, here's the formulas and now let's do it. It's like, let's do these things together, and we'll do it with the software, and we'll see how you can interpret the output at the same time. Because I noticed that there's, in teaching, often we keep the theory and the practical side quite separate. And so when they try to look for it, when they go into the workplace, then making that jump it's a big gap that they have to bridge. And so this is trying to bridge that gap a little bit. So just to scroll down, so then there's some text, obviously. And then, so there's each part is divided into around 5 or 6 different questions, which instructors can use like independently or together, and they can tweak it according to their teaching needs. And one thing that's useful in this site is that there's something called walkthroughs. So these are also available for the R and the Google Sheets, but it's to help students learn a little bit for themselves. So one example here is that there are some videos. So there's a video of someone talking through like the exact spreadsheet that the students will be using and what buttons to click, and but then the students can also use a static walkthrough. So here, these are like annotated screenshots where basically you're telling the students exactly what you need to click. And here, so say, oh, this is what you do with the data, and then they just click through all the panels. And then finally, there's some interpretation of the output. So like we got the students to make a frequency table, and it says, now, this is the output you've got, and what does it mean? Because that's also a tricky thing that students find that kind of tricky. So one thing that's useful is that the site also has solutions. So you can see here, there's some solutions. And this can still be used for assessment because these are only partial solutions. So for example, these show the time periods 1951 to 1980, a frequency table. But if you wanted to use this for assessment, you could set different time periods, different years, different months or different seasons, so that students wouldn't be able just to look at the answers. So then they would be able to get the instructions and then tweak it and learn things for themselves. So in order, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now because that's I've shown you the resource. But the question of why Excel and not Stata and R, I think that especially for introductory students of economics or students of social sciences in general, they can be a little bit scared of data and a little bit scared of coding directly with software. So Excel is something that they should be vaguely familiar with, because at least most computers come with Excel installed in them. So they should, there should be minimal time spent learning the interface and then more time spent actually playing with the data. So secondly, there are some other freely available software like R, but again, those have coding. There's other software, Stata, for example, you need to pay for a license. And I think the final reason is employability, because most students will not go to work in academia. So when they go work in a company, most people will be using Excel. Some companies use R. So in terms of developing skills that they actually need for the workplace, I think Excel is a good place to start.
Thank you very much, Eileen. So I'm going to jump directly in my second question. And I want to start with Eileen in this case. And it's exactly about what you end. You ended talking about assessments. And can you just develop a little bit more? My experience of doing economics is that it's great when I have to teach and I have to set problem sets for students. But sometimes I struggle a bit with how to set assessments, because of course, like the good thing about doing economics is that you give them all the steps to go through. But if I am trying to set an assessment, then I will say, well, of course, all the steps are already there. So how do I assess? And then we move to team. And I just want to know from your team, given that you give data first, so how do you assess your students? Do you give them a data set and then you ask questions? And I guess, Lory, I interrupted you when you were talking about assessment. So if we just kind of fill up that part, that would be great. So let's start with Eileen. Thank you.
Yeah, so to answer your question about how to use doing economics for assessment, I think that the doing economics projects are quite suitable for open-ended research project types of assessment. So for example, what I've been doing in my teaching is asking students to pick one of the themes of the project. So for example, climate change, inequality, or well-being, and all of the data sets in the projects are publicly available. So they go to the government website, for example, or the organization's website direct, and they download the data directly. So then I would encourage the students to use the data sets to visualize and explore particular aspects of the theme that may not be in the project itself. So not really following the questions to a T. And instead of asking them to write a formal research paper, I have given them the choice of how to present their results. So for example, they could write a blog in the style of like The Conversation or Vox EU, or a short consultancy style report. So this is just thinking more broadly about employability and transferable skills. So getting students to do things that they might be doing in the workplace. And also giving these kinds of assessments, students will have some sort of work samples that they can use to show future employers. So that might be useful later down the line as well.
Thank you. That's actually very useful. Tim?
Sure. So you were asking about assessments. So, you know, the kind of the change in teaching approach that I proposed is, it doesn't really dramatically impact on assessments, because although it's associated with students being able to, you know, acquire skills for themselves, to not require spoon feeding information, which is the real benefits that you're going for. Students are willing to do this kind of stuff. You know, we shouldn't really be assessing students on things that they've never really done before, you know what I mean? Because then that almost becomes a little bit unfair. So yeah, generally when I assess this kind of stuff, it is using data sets, actually providing a data set to students and asking them to interpret, and hopefully that, you know, in having asked students, and I mean, to be clear, that I used this in an interdisciplinary quantitative module, which did deal with some economic ideas, some environmental, ecological ideas that were completely generated by data. Sorry.
Can I follow up? Like, so do you give them the data set and then the questions, or do you give data set and questions together when you assess? Is this a group project? I just kind of, you know, for Eileen and for Lory, I can put it in my mind very clearly what they are doing, but I just don't really know how. Okay, you have been giving them data first and then like allowing the students time to work with this and then coming to the lecture. So when it comes to assessment, do you do the same or something changes?
No, that actually, so now you put it like that. No, something does change, because in giving students data first, before any lectures, before you discuss theory and relationships, you provide them very little. You provide minimal scaffolding to prod them and persuade them to maybe look at the data in a particular way, in such a way that it informs what will be talked about in the lecture, so that students come, if you like, primed to talk about this thing. But when it comes to actual assessment, then students get a much more defined set of questions, because, you know, in theory, you want them to answer a specific set of questions. That's what you're assessing them on, as opposed to the more abstract kind of task of exploring the data, which is what we want students to be doing before lectures. And in response to your group work, yes, group work's fine in assessment. It depends ultimately whether you want to if you depending upon the size of the task, if you have group work, you can make it a very, very involved data task. Otherwise, if you want it to be an individual project, then obviously you scale the size of the data task accordingly.
Lory?
Okay, so in terms of the assessment that I designed when I was teaching on this module, well, I had a very small cohort of students. I think there were only 16 students enrolled in the module, because it was the first year that that module was run, actually. So it was quite easy, you know, to set up and to monitor the students during the exam. And it was a face-to-face, well, it was set up in a lab. So basically, you know, the instructor could easily check what the students were doing in terms of, you know, trying to prevent cheating, for example. So the way it worked is well, actually, I released the data set, and so I gave them a data set, and I gave them the questions both online and on an exam book, because they had to sign, you know, the exam book at the time. And then they worked for 2 hours on the exam, and then they submitted the assessment on Moodle. And then obviously we downloaded the Excel file. We marked what we wanted to mark. We marked the exercise, and I looked at what I wanted to look, which is, you know, if they were able to solve the exercise, for example, inserting, you know, I don't know, functions or formulas, or creating the histogram the way I've asked it to create, or in a different way. Now, thinking about the current situation, I think that, and dealing with a much bigger cohort of students, I think that an idea could be, for example, to create different data sets and randomly assign the data set to different subgroups of the students, and then this could be, I don't know, could be given to the students prior to the exam. Like, I'm not sure about the practicalities now, but I was just thinking maybe an hour or half an hour before the exam, and then you release the questions online, as we are currently doing now, or we did in May and June, and I think that they can work on the assessment and they can submit it online. Moodle could be an option. I don't have experience of any other sort of virtual learning environment for this. So.
Well, but thank you, Lory. And you partially actually answered my third question. It was like, we know we're moving online, and so how you're going to move this? Have you thought about how your teaching is going to change when we move online? What are you going to do to kind of keep your students engaged and make sure that they are actually working on the data, and how are you going to move your assessment online too? So I don't know if you want to add anything else, or we kind of move to Eileen and then Tim. So Lory, if you want to add anything, other.
No, I mean that's how I think I was. That's how I thought this could be done in the current situation. If this is able to prevent cheating, well, that's an open question. But maybe there are other ways we can use in order to make sure that the students cannot cheat, or maybe we can give less weight to the final assessment and focus more on a group coursework. But yes, this is the way I was thinking the exam can be done at the moment, giving different data sets and maybe changing the questions a little bit between different subsample of students, and ask the questions in a way that the students have to prove also, some critical thinking, not just, reproduce, steps in Excel to solve an exercise, but also try to provide interpretation of the data and, like more reflective approach to teaching and learning, I would say. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Eileen? Eileen, I think you're on mute.
Yep, I unmuted myself now. So with regards to using Excel for assessment, I think I'm a little less worried about students cheating in getting the output. So for example, if you're asking them to derive a certain, like calculate the mean or get a certain chart, I'm less concerned about cheating with that, because in the real world, they're going to have access to Google and they're going to be working in a team anyway. So whether they know how to remember all the formulas and the kinds of inputs in order to generate the number or the chart is not that important. So what I've focused on in my assessment is their interpretation of the results. So even if they're working in teams of people and they generate one output, everybody has to write a separate report and giving their own interpretation of the output. So I would put more emphasis on individual interpretation rather than being able to derive set results.
Thank you. And I guess, Tim, you can tell us a bit more about cheating as well. I know you have been working on a project on cheating stuff. So, yeah, moving online and a bit of cheating.
So, what was I going to say? Sorry, there's a bit of an echo on here. I can hear myself talking. So the idea of moving online and giving students time with data, I mean, it lends itself perfectly to, the idea that students are going to be doing things away from the classroom. Ideally, what you want to get to is a situation where students, as Steve Proud put in the chat on YouTube earlier, without someone looking over their shoulder, checking what they're doing. You're trying to train students to be able to dig away and find help for themselves. You know, this idea of, well, if we think about how any of us has learned anything in the past year or the past 2 years, we went online to find the answer. Any stata commands, any Excel commands, we don't know how to do it. We weren't told it. We found it out for ourselves. And that's really where you want to get to. And the idea that students are not present in the classroom when they're doing that, well, that's perfect. That's what you want. How you facilitate group work in these environments, I think I'll go back to the previous hour. There were a lot of suggestions made, and you know, these are going to be down to technical solutions that I, at the moment, I still haven't actually got an answer for, but it's going to require some exploration. And sorry, there was a question about assessment there, Steffi. I realize I've been on a bit of a monologue for a second.
No, that's fine. It was more about cheating rather than assessment, and you know, what can you tell us about, you know, avoidance, that going online. And well, we know very well that a lot of our colleagues had problems thinking about, oh, but because assessments are going to be removed, the students are going to cheat more. Do you want us to say anything about it, given that I know you have been doing research on poor academic practice?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would just echo what Eileen and Lory were saying, that it's not about producing just a statistic, because what is much more important is the ability of students and encouraging students to think reflectively about what it is they're doing. So providing students, asking students to find their own data sets and asking them to produce certain information, to answer certain questions that they might be interested in doing. That they might be relevant to the data set. Sorry, I've got an echo again. And then, yeah, but the most important thing is asking students. You know, you spent an entire term giving students data, asking them to dig around, and then maybe when you get to the lecture, talking through what they found and what relationships might mean. Well, hopefully, over the course of a term, over 10 weeks of continuously again and again and again asking students to dig into data, that when it comes to assessment time, then actually they will dig in, they dig into the data, and they can talk about the relationships that they found, that hopefully they might be able to interpret them themselves. So I'm not particularly worried about cheating, as it were. Students might talk, they might talk about trading, how do you calculate a mean or something like that. But as Eileen said, that's not the cheating you're worried about. The cheating is when they basically share their interpretations, but then that's going to be pretty easy to spot, you know?
Okay. So, Christian, you had a question.
That's great. Could I just jump in here? So many have talked about the critical thinking part. And there was a discussion in the chat on the experiential learning and the learning curve for the student. So I think we all agree that Excel is really good for experiential learning. You start to actually see what is going on in the data, but often there's not enough time to reflect on it. So how do we make sure that the reflection part is happening, reflecting on what we have done, what has happened in the group work, the fore and back between the teacher and the student? How do we do that in an online world? So I guess that could be for any one of the panel members. So how do we, what any ideas how we look at the reflection part of this learning journey, and not just going through the Excel exercise? And yeah. Tim.
So some things, types of sort of small, low-weight assessments that I've tried in various other modules, not necessarily relating to this, but which might be interesting, is this idea of students, specifically if you have persistent groups throughout a term, so that actually, you know, the same students are working together week in, week out, is possibly the idea that you ask students to maintain a blog where they may actually talk about the stuff that they've done in the lecture, and they have to produce a blog post every week. I think also just more immediately, even beyond simply producing a blog that requires them to ask, I think we as lecturers, certainly if you take the perspective, and I guess I'm working within a paradigm where you give the students the data beforehand and then they bring their ideas to the lecture. I think as a lecturer, giving students a voice and an opportunity to talk at the start of the lecture about what it is that they found, and actually sort of not just going straight into some theory, but actually talking to the students and providing students with a voice within the lecture where they can actually think, critically interrogating them on what it is, why they thought they found what they did, what might be the reasons for this, before embarking into our usual lecturing. Is really useful for students, not just in terms of allowing them time to reflection, but also in terms of just building their confidence that what they've done matters to you as a lecturer, and that even if they got it slightly wrong or they misinterpreted something, the very fact that they attempted to interpret and attempted to explain something is actually really important. So yeah, I'll give someone else a go on that.
Great, and I guess we can do that even in a Zoom call, in a small group setting, online, on Blackboard Collaborate. There was some discussion in the chat window, which was interesting, that maybe students should run part of the session, in part of the Zoom session, and report on their findings and on their research output. Maybe anyone else from the panel would like to kind of suggest any ideas how we facilitate reflection on all these Excel projects in an online world? Maybe Eileen, any ideas?
Yeah, so I have been using Excel in online teaching last term, and I've been teaching in small group settings, so small groups of around 3 students, so kind of Oxford style tutorial. And so it has been quite a close-knit group. And when we did tutorials in Zoom, students would be assigned certain questions. So I would assign certain questions to certain students, and then they would be in charge of presenting their answer to that question. And then they would do a screen share and then talk about not just the sort of chart or table that they produced, but also how they got to the answer, and maybe also talk about some difficulties that they experienced with reaching the final answer and how they solved the problem. So a little bit of that experiential learning that was mentioned earlier. So I think getting students to do screen shares is quite useful.
Right. How many students did you have in that group where a setup would work like that?
Around 3 to 5. I think, I'm not sure if it would work with anything larger, but yeah.
Sure, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Any other ideas on the reflection part? Lory?
So I don't know if Lory wants to come back on that.
Sorry?
Don't know whether you want to add anything on the reflection part, otherwise I can ask another question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so, we were talking about lecturers being very worried about cheating, but I wasn't worried about cheating. What I'm worried about next year is about how to keep students engaged, right? I'm not meeting students in the classroom. I'm not seeing them. So sometimes I'm not sure whether they're going to be watching or not. So let's start with Lory. Lory, do you have any ideas how to kind of make sure that the students are actually following us, they are not falling behind, or and how all this kind of the use of Excel can help us do this?
Okay, what I did for this specific module I taught in statistics was to create quizzes online. So what I've done to engage the students with the more theoretical side of the module was to do these quizzes online, to make sure that on top of the practical side of it, they could learn some statistical. Obviously, they had to learn some statistical concepts. So I think quizzes online and that provides immediate feedback is a good idea to engage the students with the more theoretical part of the modules. And in terms of the engagement in classes, I think that a good idea is to leave them with an open question. For example, like if we all agree that somehow a way to move forward is to offer the students some sort of asynchronous material and then synchronous interaction with them. So I think that we could leave an open question at the end of the lecture, and then start from that point to discuss with the students what did they get from the from that specific question, and try to answer the question together, so that there's always a link between what they are listening in the asynchronous material and what we do when we interact with them. So this could be a way to make sure that they are engaged with our lectures, for example.
Eileen,
I've heard also discussions about introducing, for example, forums where the students can, for example, discuss, the solutions to these questions that we may leave to them, and then start the live stream sessions by linking, our discussion to the question in the asynchronous part. I think this could be a way to get them engaged. Yeah.
Yes. Eileen, you said you were already teaching online last term. So how do you engage your students? How do you keep them engaged?
So I found that actually including practical exercises like in Excel is a great way to get them engaged, because they can they know that they're learning some sort of transferable skills for employability. It's going to help them, and they generate some useful outputs as well. So when they can go from the raw data to getting a nice chart, that gets them quite excited, actually. Yes, I think that the short answer is just including more practical exercises that gives them a clear link between what they're learning and what they're going to be doing someday, maybe as a career in the future. It gets them quite excited and engaged.
And I think that's good practice, even if we don't go online or we go back to normal at some point. Tim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of say that, I think we do require a moment of kind of critical self-reflection when we talk about the challenges of engaging students online. Because, to assume that we engage them brilliantly at the moment is, I'm not convinced we do. So it's a different set of challenges. But, I think, as Eileen said, a lot of the things that we do at the moment or don't do are really relevant. But in terms of actually, how we might engage students online, again, much like everybody else or most people, we have ideas, but we're not going to know fully whether or not they work until we actually, the proof's in the pudding. But I have had success, though, in terms of actually, for any type of out-of-class activities, whether it's data first or whether it's between weeks, the idea of actually maintaining persistent groups throughout a term, whereby you build an expectation into your course that these groups will meet, and whether or not it's to compare individual notes or work individually on things, work as a group collectively on something, it's moderately successful, I found. But I have no concrete answers on what's going to be the panacea for engaging students moving forward.
But I think that was I think you got a very good point. Like, we actually sometimes fail to engage students even face to face. So it's just kind of to think about. I think we have 5 minutes left, and we would like to show you the results of the Mentimeter poll we just did before. But before that, I would like to say thank you very much to our panel today. Thank you, team. Thank you, Lory. And especially thank you, Eileen, because she is in Hong Kong and I know it's very late there. And for me, it will be my bedtime. So thank you very much for joining us today and keeping you awake so late. So many questions, a lot of food for thought. Just remember that all the resources that we discussed today are available on the Economics Network website. And yes, so two things. Alvin, if you want to put us the panel view, please, so we don't see only team, but we see all our panelists. And then I thank you, and then pass to you for the Mentimeter.
Yes, and so let me just add my thanks to Steffi's, to all the panelists, including the first set of panelists, so Wendy, Humberto and Annika, and then of course Tim, Lory and Eileen as well. And just to say one thing before I show you the results, if I can, because I now have the challenge of sharing my screen. I have no idea if that's going to work. But just to say that one of the things that we're trying to do with this set of sessions in the Economics Network's Symposium is just to try out some different ways of communicating and interacting with students and staff. We might use some of these ideas for our own symposia in the future and training. So we would like to hear some feedback. I mean, this is just a kind of slightly fancy example of just streaming a Zoom call, essentially, of actually streaming 2 Zoom calls. Our first synchronous session was actually a participatory Zoom call. And so, you know, as we're all sort of finding our way in this brave new world, it would be quite useful for us to hear from you what it was like interacting in this kind of space as opposed to the Zoom space that we're all very familiar with. So, okay, so I'm going to look over here because that's where my computer with Mentimeter is. And I'm going to try...
Well, Alvin, you do that. Let me just also kind of advertise a little bit our theme 4. And remember, we have 4 themes at this symposium. So the next theme is going to be on assessments. That's going to take place in September. And we are still looking for collaboration. So if you think you have done something about assessment, online assessment that can help, please get in contact either with me or with Claudia, that I think is following us on YouTube. And we are very happy to talk. Pass to you, Alvin.
Great. Okay. So I don't propose really to talk through these. I just wanted to show you. What you'd answered. There were we did have a bit of a problem with the link. Again, partly this was just to show that it is possible to do polling in this kind of environment. So those were the responses. Most of you who responded had used Excel in some way before, and would like to see more examples and resources on the website. And those of you who hadn't were interested in trying, so that's great. And then we just asked this simple question about which tools you're using in the data part of your programs, and so you can see there that not surprising to me at all, actually, that Stata is the big one. A few people using R. I am, I guess, slightly surprised at how few people answered Excel here. I mean, it's so readily available as we've been talking about today. So hopefully this session will have given you some ideas for how you can use Excel. So again, just to remind everybody that there is a theme 4. It's coming in September. It's on the very important theme of assessment. And so it just then falls to me finally then to thank all the panelists again, but also thank all the participants who contributed through the chat facility on YouTube. I also want to thank obviously Steffi and Christian, who did almost all of the work while I was sitting kind of just watching here in the background. And also you probably weren't aware that Ashley Late is also in the background flashing these chats on the screen. And doing all of the kind of overlay work. So very much a team effort. And so thank you very much.
Thank you to Martin as well, Alvin, that has done all the website.
So and that's very important also, because all of the resources were put on the website, and so that is a fantastic resource there now for people to look at, not just these resources, but we've also created a page with a lot of ideas about just blended learning in general, and so Martin's been busy getting that working in the background as well. So thank you very much. We have just come to 4 o'clock. I think it's a good idea to finish on time.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.